Hi, Isaac.
Rabbi, good morning. It's so great to see you.
Good morning. Excited to do one verse of Matthew.
Uh-huh. We're looking forward to it.
Yeah.
The Gospel according to Matthew, chapter 6, verse 24. No one can serve two masters, for either he will hate the one and love the other, or he will be devoted to the one and despise the other.
So,
You
so
cannot serve you
yeah.
cannot serve God, you cannot serve God and money.
Right. It's so interesting. This is again a somewhat self-contained unit. This unit is also cited by Luke in 1613. While the only difference is in Luke, it's a little bit more ambiguous. Even though it finishes both with money over here and over there, in Luke 1613, by the parable of the unjust steward, it's um, in Matthew, the previous verses, it can mean anything, that placing anything above God. Well, it finishes with money nonetheless. So
So
it
let's
seems to
take a
be
step
what we're talking about.
let's take a step back, right?
Yeah.
What is brilliant about this verse? It seems obvious, right? I mean, so what is brilliant?
I don't know. I want to hear. You tell me. I feel like this verse is famous, but I am not sure why. And I have a lot of questions on this verse that I'd love to hear. Why do you think it's famous?
I mean, it's catchy. Like you cannot serve God and mammon.
Catchy.
It's not a
That's it.
parable.
Write a
It's not a
song.
metaphor. It's not a metaphor like the other verses. Earlier verses of the eye is a lamp of the body, and it's so complex. This is simple. It's direct. It's like you cannot serve both. I go, but
So it sounds like you have a lot of advice for Jesus. Whenever he writes the next mound, he should stay away from from like Matthew 6:22 to 23 of the eye of the lamp. Stay away
yeah.
from the salt of the land, but really focus on the simplicity of no man can serve two masters.
To
Okay,
masters. It seems
we'll
like
have
and it's
Jesus. We'll have Jesus
yeah.
do it.
It seems like they're on two different ends of the spectrum, right? Some of these verses are so have rich metaphors and they have rich layers of meaning, and this one is
There's a
just a
metaphor.
faith.
There's a metaphor too. No one is assuming we're talking about slaves. It's not
Well,
like it's
no,
not a metaphor.
no man can serve two masters. The meaning in many ways is obvious, and he makes it very clear. And he says you cannot serve God and money. Like if the last section was not there, then it's open to question. What do you mean two masters? Is it God and this? Is it God and
So
this
you
and
don't
this?
only like the simplicity, you also like the conclusion. At the end of the verse, it says, by the way, you might, when we spoke about the eye of the lamp, is it the evil inclination? Is it what the eye sees? I have no clue in the end what it is. But over here, we have a concluding point of the verse, only one verse. And it says, you cannot serve God and mammon and wealth. So there,
Yeah,
it's very clear. And it's very interesting if you think about it. When you look at 6:19 to 21, that's very clearly talking about money. 6:24 is very clearly talking about money, at least the conclusion point of it. And 6:22 to 23, I feel like we should assume it's talking about money, right? We should
yeah.
say that maybe it's not equalization. Maybe it means that your body can't be full of seeking out money. And we didn't really discuss that as a possibility.
But
Even though
here's
it seems to be sandwiched between these two money focused
to money
treasures and
focus.
money. Yeah.
And here's the thing, which is also the big, the question which I'm grappling with, as in his audience were not wealthy people. They were not New York. They were not Wall Street bankers. They were ordinary people living day-to-day life. Probably had some
You
living.
can't own a goat and serve God.
Got it. And then I go, okay, so if you told somebody who is living in a hand to mouth or have some savings, you cannot serve God and money. It's a different meaning. Versus if you spoke to the very wealthy, a banker on Wall Street who has millions of dollars, to them, I think if they were the audience, this message would probably have a different, would have certain significance, as in you can't serve God and money. If you came and told me, Isaac, you can't serve God and money, fine. I go, okay, I only have so much of money,
I think
So
that we definitely have to view this though as a more larger text. Like the New Testament definitely views itself as more of the eternal text, and Jesus was addressing himself to people on the mound and the future generations. So I feel like the historical reality is that we would view their wealth as nothing, and there probably weren't so many people wealthy, but the message would resonate with poor and rich nonetheless.
but at that time, right, he was living in a place in time, at a point in time, having conversation with a certain group of people. Like it's not as in I'm speaking to future generations. He's speaking to people then and there. It has to at least, I feel like it should at least something they should be able to
Maybe he
identify
was
with.
looking at one guy in the eyes during this time. That was the wealth. That was the guy wearing like the gold breastplate.
Yeah. Anyway, this verse, right, with this statement, you cannot serve God and money. from what I've based on our conversations, I take this that within Judaism, having your again living a certain life is so important. It seems so obvious that at least within your faith, within Judaism, that God is supreme or God is on a pedestal. It's you can't certain things are beyond the realm of competition. Like for example, sukkah, you're fasting, and all these things. These are non-negotiable. These are things you do. It's part of who you are, right? So from that perspective, like this, what is? I'm still not sure. Like what is this? It's
To
not.
think that people weren't hedonistic at any point and didn't seek out wealth would be crazy. So you're making a good point in that question. Your first question is, who is he really speaking to? Number two, what did this message really resonate to those people? Again, so I think we can even take a step back. When it says you can't serve two masters, where a slave will either hate and love, devote, despise, I somewhat wonder if the last line, you cannot serve God and wealth, because it's so different from the way 622 and 23, 623 finish. It's so different from the way 621 finishes that it almost feels like a gloss to me. It feels like this was added by someone after the fact in order to say, by the way, you might think you can't serve Jesus or God and something else, but I'm telling you, this verse is actually talking about. This is my commentary. It's talking about money. The fact that it also shows from Luke would mean that it's an early gloss, but I think that we definitely could look at this verse of 624 in two ways. One is specifically thinking about money, and one as thinking about any other mistress, anything else but God. And we see this in Maimonides a lot. Maimonides says that you're supposed to be infatuated with God. And every second that you're not kind of infatuated with God, you're kind of missing the point of the world. And I think that is really being modeled here, that there's no side mistress of Jesus. It's either
Correct, right?
you
But
have the
isn't
kingdom is nigh, or
yeah.
you're a heathen sinner.
Yeah, but here's the thing. But isn't that the central theme of Judaism? We see the Pharisees, right? They keep the law to the word, as in they fast, they tithe, they do all this. And so
No,
my
I think
question
it's
is,
mixing up like infatuation with proscription and prescription. Because I don't eat pig, it doesn't mean I don't think about eating pig all day. Because I fast, it doesn't mean I think all the time about eating food. I think there's always this idea of moderation in Judaism, that
yeah,
here's how you fast, here's how you mourn, here's how you eat. There's always prescription and prescriptions. It's meant to guide your life. But
uh-huh,
only certain kind of extremist, more fundamentalist personality gets this level of, well, therefore I'm going to have this mystical moment of kind of of joining God in this infatuation. And again, I think the people who we see infatuated with God, we generally think are freaks. We think
yeah.
these people are kind of missing the point, like, whoa, God put us on earth to be physical, you have to eat, you have to go to the bathroom. And anytime you try to transcend the world and try to be more angelic and less physical, you're kind of like missing your 70 years on earth.
Okay,
So I
so
feel like
then
Jesus rejects that 70-year attitude for sure.
yeah, okay. So let's rephrase this a bit. In our earlier conversation last week, you mentioned as to how the ascetic life is not something you value within Judaism, or within Judaism you have to you have to
The ascetic life in Judaism is allowed and it's noted as a religious life, but it's not something that is encouraged for the masses.
correct. Yeah, no, but so you mentioned, but it's a focus on you go live the world, have kids, have a family, flourish, be multi.
Party, yeah.
So is this worse? Is this thing you cannot serve God and mammon? You cannot serve the masters to your point where you had to be totally in love with God, or when you
Well,
go to
I think what
Maimonides,
you're saying is
when you
true, yeah.
when you
Yeah.
go to Maimonides, right, you have to have the deep devotion to God. Is this verse a challenge to that way of living, to that way of thinking, or is this verse encouraging an
This,
ascetic lifestyle?
this is nothing but classic Jesus. This is, I personally feel, for where we are right now, Jesus is very systemic and he doesn't kind of waver. Again, we keep saying Jesus had, like, we have like two main points. If I had to summarize what we said till now, we said live a super arrogative life
Mhm.
and live a black and white life.
Black and white life.
Don't
Yeah.
live in the grays. Don't like, again, I actually preach the grays. Rabbi Lamb, who was the president, the two
Yeah. Yeah.
presidents
Yeah.
ago at Yeshiva University, he used to say that I forgot the exact line, but the religious life is one of moderation, but it's really hard to get people enthused about that life, because moderation, the golden Aristotle's golden mean, one that we say we look at, we're not too happy, we're not too sad, we're not too rich, we're not too poor, is one that makes sense, but it's
Mhm.
hard to make people feel passionate about. what Jesus is speaking, this black and white life, is a passionate life. It's one where you extricate yourself from all the things that are external to
Yeah,
your very essence, to your soul. And again, Orthodox Judaism will embrace a rejection of this attitude. They'll say
yeah,
you should be enthusiastic about the moderate life. Don't have one kid, don't have 10 kids, have some in the middle. Don't have $1 billion, don't have $10, have somewhere in the middle. Don't eat only carbs, don't eat only fats, eat in the middle. So all these things. And that level of pluralism, that level of lack of extremism will be the life that we embrace and that we encourage. So again, I just see Jesus as rejecting this. And this is something that we could keep asking. Was Jesus speaking in a way that was larger than he really, or was he speaking in an exaggerated form? Was he speaking hyperbolically? And he was saying like, this is what you should do, but do what you can do. And again, like, I'm not sure, I don't generally see Jesus as a moral individual leader. I can't really see Jesus alone in a room in a box with a person saying, oh, you should do this with your life, you should do this with your life, you should marry, you should sell this stock, you should put your shoe on this way. I see Jesus is really giving like overarching messages for how a society ought to kind of embrace. But again, I can't imagine Jesus the rabbi. Jesus kind of saying, okay, tell me about your kids, how they doing. Tell me about what you're eating on the weekends. I don't see him caring about these things. He has a
yeah.
bigger.
So yeah, so this verse in the free it does in a way sound like it does encourage and ascetic lifestyle. This idea of moderation and indulging the world, engaging the world. The world is lost in this, um, and so to your point, right? Was he trying to be hyperbolic just to highlight a certain thing? Was he trying? I mean, maybe he was trying to be hyperbolic or give an
Don't be
extreme
like the
thing.
hypocrites, he says over and over. You don't know when he says the hypocrites, he's being hyperbolically. When he says don't store up your treasures, he's being hyperbolic. It's hard to know. Okay.
And I'm all, yeah, go ahead. No.
No, I was gonna let me hear because I was gonna switch the topic.
I'm still so intrigued now. He's intrigued about his now on the topic of black and white, right? He says, we have God and money, and then he says you will be devoted to the one and despise the other.
Okay,
Now,
so we'll go in a second over the verse. Let's just give a couple. I figured I didn't think we were going to start this conversation, but I figured that we would try to break up what was the historical reality of two masters. Was he speaking in a sense that represented something that he experienced? That's one point I would like to explore. And a second point I'd like to explore is specifically those verses, like you're saying. So I figured I looked up a little bit. I couldn't find anywhere in Roman law where it specifically said you're allowed to have two masters. But what we see in Roman law is that you had complete control of your slave. Your slave was completely your property. And I imagine if two people in Jewish law or Roman law bought a person in partnership, there wouldn't be anyone. Let's say a guy's worth $200, and two guys paid $100 for him, they split him. He's your property. I don't think anyone in Roman law or Jewish law would necessarily care. Yeah, go on.
What about Greek law? Because again, just before his time, they were ruled by the Greeks, right?
Jesus would have lived under Roman law, not Greek.
Okay.
So, anyways, a lot of the Roman slaves came from Greek countries.
Yeah.
So all the more so. Who's the most famous slave? Spartacus, right? It was like 80 BCE, and he was enslaved and freed himself along a bunch of Greek people. But Greek people were fodder, and they say during the destruction of the temple in the year 70 that roughly 1 million Jews were either killed or enslaved. And when you look at the Arch of Titus, the most famous depiction of the spoils of the temple being taken back to Rome, you'll see a bunch of Jewish slaves being taken back with them, and they're sold in the market. And Jewish life was kind of destroyed at that point. Anyway, so what we see is that you probably could have two masters. We also see, if you look at, what was it? I think it's Acts 16:16. I think I marked it. Let me just find it.
This is the first time we've gone to Acts now. This is
it's not on me. I wasn't naturally going to go to Acts. It's just that Acts, actually, I thought you would like this point. So Acts 16:16, I'm going to read to you. And it came to pass, as we went to prayer, a certain damsel possessed of a spirit of divination met us, which brought her masters, in the plural, much gain by soothsaying. So what's really interesting, you think that the Acts would be very sensitive to the fact that the Sermon on the Mount said you can't have two masters. And Acts right there says this damsel, this woman, had two masters. Yeah. So what we see, though, is really interesting is that this is more of a metaphor than we thought. It's not a metaphor that is actually true in a literal sense. A lot of times our metaphors we try to say have a aspect of truth. So when God takes us out with a right hand, that right hand represents something. Or when we say that you're salt of the earth, we try to think out what salt was. Or we say eye of lamp, try to think of the eye of lamp is. And that's part of the metaphor is understanding the truth of the thing. So over here, the idea of you can't serve two masters, yes, you can. We see in Roman law, in Jewish law, in Acts 16:16, you
You
100%
can.
have two masters. So I think that's just really like, it's almost cute and funny that we really understand the metaphor so well that we understand that even though in reality it is not true, but we understand. We understand that it means like, it doesn't really mean a master. It means like someone you're devoted to. So that's one point I thought was really interesting. I found a Rashi. So, Rashi is lived 1040, 1105. He's the most famous Bible commentator in Jewish
Hmm.
tradition as a medieval exegete.
Hmm.
And there's a verse in Exodus in 21:6. Here's the verse that Exodus says. It's talking about the Jew, in this case, I guess, an Israelite. If an Israelite wants to remain as a slave, in general, you're supposed to go free in the sabbatical year. But if you choose to remain a slave to your master, then you have to have your ear pierced. I don't know if you know that. They would stick the slave onto next to a doorpost and they would pierce his ear. So I'm going to read you the verse, Exodus 21:6. Then his master shall bring him to the judges and shall bring him to the door or to the doorpost. And his master shall pierce through his ear with an awl, and he shall serve him forever, or at least until the Jubilee year. So Rashi on that, as I mentioned, Rabbi Shlomo Yitzchaki, who was the commentator on this verse, he says something that I thought really relates to our verse. He says, "What is it about an ear that it should be bored? What a crazy thing! Why would
Yeah.
the Bible tell us to bore an ear? Why not a nose? Why nothing?" Of all the organs in the body, the Tana Rav Yochanan ben Zakkai, which is, he lived a little bit after Jesus, but it was almost a contemporary. He said the ear that heard the words of God at Mount Sinai, and he heard in the 10 Commandments, you shall not steal. And nonetheless, he went and stole. And hence, in this situation, he was sold into slavery. Let it be bored. So that's one interpretation. But the second one, I think, is the more important one. And if the person, the Israelite, sold himself because of poverty, then Rashi comments, an ear that heard on Mount Sinai, the theophany, the words of the 10 Commandments, and heard that the Israelites are slaves unto me. The
Hmm.
verse in Leviticus 25:55 says that Israelites are slaves unto God. The ear that heard those words about we are already slaves, and then they went, this Israelite, this Jew, went and acquired a different master by saying that he was sold to slavery, and therefore he said, I'm giving myself up to be a slave, and therefore I'm acquiring a second master. Let that person be bored, they pierced in his ear to show that he didn't really
Understand.
incorporate what he was supposed to do. So over here, there's a very strong condemnation, very much like Jesus is saying, according to Rashi. Jesus was saying you can't have two masters. And what's interesting, you have this idea over here in Rashi on this verse in Exodus that you can't have two masters. That's quoting the verse in Leviticus 25:55 and saying that if you're already a slave from Mount Sinai, where the Israelites took a pledge for all time to be a slave to God, you're actually making it that you're ruining that slavery by taking second master. So I thought, we always look for the rabbinic parallel when we're doing.
Yeah.
I think this is a perfect rabbinic parallel where we
Yeah.
see that the idea, the literal historical sense makes no sense, but Jesus might have been aware of the rabbinic tradition in Leviticus that we already can't have a second master, and that exactly parallels what we're saying here. That if you have one master, namely God, you can't have a second master. And we'll analyze what it means when Jesus explains what it means. Because I think in Jewish tradition, we don't actually need to explain more. We say, what does it mean you can't have another master? You serve God, and all servings have to be Him. The second that you take on another serving, you're a servant to someone else, you're failing. And I think that's exactly what it means here. But while in Judaism, it's saying that you follow the prescriptions and proscriptions that were prescribed to you, that was commanded to you by God, in Christianity, and it doesn't necessarily mean that, it seems. Like, I
Yeah.
don't anyone who reads verse 624 says, and therefore I must keep the commandments. I think in here, I understood it. It means like, and therefore you must have a relationship with God. or Jesus, you must follow him in some bigger sense. But it could be because we're being too modern. It could mean, just like we said earlier, this means you can't have two masters. You got to follow the commandments, and it could be at that. But I think this is a great, perfect parallel between the two, that they both somewhat reject the historical sense and go into a theological sense of servitude. So this is a theological servitude.
Yeah, thank you. This is so very helpful for clarifying this and for the background. The question I have for you is, right now, in the verse we saw in Exodus and in Leviticus, where you're slaves of God. As Jews, you're slaves of God. So wouldn't that be codified into your law? We started by saying, right, within Judaism, there is no rule that says that you cannot have two. There's no rule saying that you cannot have two masters.
Listen, there's a pragmatism versus a reality. The pragmatism is that Judaism allows servitude.
Ah, okay.
But it could condemn. Listen, there's the most famous crazy verse. There's two famous crazy verses. I think a lot of times when people look to the Old Testament for morality, two things really stick out. One is the genocidally kill the children, everyone of Amalek. Genocide is prescribed in the Bible, so that generally sticks out. And the second one is that you're allowed to rape a woman when you're at war because your evil inclination. So those two are generally, I think, stick out as, let's use the second one, the rape. Like, you shouldn't do it. But the way that Rashi explains is that the Bible speaks to your evil inclination, and it speaks to where you are at that moment. Mm-hmm. So we allow this level of theological perfection to exist side by side with the realities of their slaves. And this is one of the questions that people ask today. If we lived in a theological theocracy that was run by the Old Testament, would we encourage people with slavery again? Or is that only because the Bible is speaking for the historical reality? There was slavery, but now that slavery has been stamped out, at least in certain places, we know obviously there's slaves today, but where slavery is for the most part been stamped out, therefore we should allow that. Like offerings, there's a big argument in the Jewish tradition that some people want the temple to be rebuilt so we can do the offerings again. Today, on the third day of Sukkot, we would have offered 11 cows. You know how expensive that is? It's like, 11 cows, one ram, one he-goat, 2 rams, one he-goat, 14 lambs on top of the 2 lambs that we brought every day. So we would have killed, like, I don't know, what does that equal? It's like 40 animals, not 40, 30 something animals today alone if the temple was standing.
Yeah.
Some of them aren't even eaten. Some of them are just like burnt up to a crisp in order to, the leather is given to someone, but like for the most part, they're burnt up to a crisp. So there's the idea that is the ideal to go back to what we had in the past. I think when we ever see those pictures of what heaven looks like according to Christians,
yes,
it's never like an air-conditioned room watching ESPN. It's always like fruit. And I'm like, it's always fruit, living like one of nature with bugs. I don't know, maybe the bugs aren't biting you, but it's always like a pretty outdoor scene, which I feel like is there's an idea called the word paradise. Mm-hmm. Comes from the Greek word pardes, which means an orchard. And it's nice to think that like in the olden days, like the best they could do was paradise being outdoor with the bugs and the fruit. But I don't know. I can think of like I prefer processed food over fruit. I prefer indoors over outdoors. I prefer dead bugs over bugs. I prefer no grass over grass. I feel like a lot of times the idea that we have of this Christian paradise, and at least the pictures I see in cartoon books and coloring books, is one that like doesn't resonate with us. So the question is, do we want to go back to the past, to what it was, or do we want to go back to the future? Okay, it's a great question. Okay, so we have this idea that we also have this theological 2 masters. So before we go on, I just want to point out two more points from a biblical perspective. It's not only 2 masters. We also have, I don't know if you know the great henotheism, monotheism debate.
Oh yeah, henotheism. One, you say we worship one God, but live as though there are multiple gods.
There's a great debate among academics if Judaism went from like many gods until one God, or they always had one God. Like, was it that Abraham specifically was told to worship El, to the exclusion of the other gods, though all like to the exclusion of Baal or Dagon or any of the other ones that are in Canaan, or was that a true monotheism in that this one was the one God? So it
sounds like you're saying, is it polytheism or monotheism, right? Henotheism is something different, right? Like one believes there's only one God, but lives as there are multiple gods. Sounds like what you're alluding to is more polytheism, as in a polytheism versus monotheism.
I feel there's actually 2 forms of henotheism that you're describing. Okay. You just say so. Yeah. So henotheism a lot of times is a form of you believe it like henotheism could form if you only believe that your God is the one that has power in this. Like when Jonah, one of the things that academics say is when Jonah ran away from Israel, he got in a boat because he didn't believe that God was able to work outside of Israel. Let's just say that's true. So
Uh-huh.
if that's the case, then we
Then
also have
he,
this idea. We have this
yeah.
idea, what's really interesting, where we have, for example, Eliyahu, in the first book of Kings, chapter 18, where he goes out to battle with the prophets of Baal. And he says, "My God's better than your God." And it seems that what's interesting is that a lot of times the prophets of Baal, the idolatrous prophets, or the Egyptian people, they would be willing to worship two masters. And there was a very common idea, again, of maybe there's one God that, if you even think of the Babylonian pantheon or the Greek pantheon, the idea is like they were more than willing to worship two gods. If you think of Roman and Greek culture. So this is what I think is also interesting, that the idea of only worshiping one God is a super monotheistic, serving one master is a super monotheistic idea. When
Yep.
Jesus would have said this in the historical context of a Roman Greek culture, or one that interacts with Egyptian culture, or even one that exists it's still within Israel at that point, in Palestine at that point, there would have been people worshiping different gods. So I think that we need to also not only see the Jewish layer in this, but the rejection of the polytheistic and or henotheistic and or Roman pantheon, saying, oh, the Romans can serve two gods.
But
The
you cannot
Romans
serve.
can serve two masters, but you Jews, or you people who are my followers,
See,
cannot serve two.
this is why you're the best rabbi in the whole
Ah,
world. Yeah, that makes, in that context, this makes so much of sense right now. You cannot serve two masters. The Romans can serve, the Romans could serve multiple gods, could be
this
pantheistic,
verse,
polytheist.
yeah, this verse is really lends itself to really looking from different viewpoints, because we can see from the historical, what did Romans and Jews do at the time? Then we could view it from the theological, how did Jews view it? Then we could view it from the polytheistic, what do other people do? And so we could really see it from multiple verses. We still haven't done for the exegetical level, like what does the verse actually itself mean? But I think we see, I just want to give you one more last context. I thought this is interesting. I looked up and I said, like, is there a situation where a person literally had two masters in Jewish tradition? And while they don't talk in those terms, a lot of times you only speak one master. There's a very famous Gemara, a Talmud text in Talmud, the Babylon Talmud and Gittin, which means divorce contracts. And page 41, it says, what happens if you're owned half? Half of you is owned, because let's say you were worth $100 and you paid $50 to your master. So you actually, there's two ways to look at it. You're not free until you're free. That's one way. It's all or nothing, which is what Jesus is saying. But what Jewish tradition allows is that if you have $50 and you're able to pay $50, you're worth 100 for your master, you say, if there's 14 days and 2 weeks, I own 7 days and you own 7 days. And that is actually an idea that exists in the Talmud on page 41 of Gittin, that if you're able to pay for yourself, you're saying you own yourself half and the master owns yourself half. And the way it plays out is that what do you do that day? You said each day you go back and forth. The Monday I'm yours, Tuesday I'm mine. Wednesday. So it's interesting. We even have, at least in a legalistic theory, about what it would actually mean to own yourself. So, and what's cool about this, but I thought also you would like, even the way that Jewish tradition frames it, you really only have one master at one time. On Monday, you're my master. On Tuesday, I'm a master. And if anything, this is also the legalism frames it in a theological way. When the theology of Leviticus that we said that you can only you're my slave from Mount Sinai, we see that it's not that I own some things of the slave and you own some things. Is that one day I'm completely my own master, and one day you are completely the master. So we see this idea again of this one masterhood.
Yeah, thank you for this, right? So on this word master, right? So we have God, we have master. These are two different terms, right? Does the word master could this also be a synonymous for God? Because by definition,
100%. Yeah. The word. So the tetragrammaton that Jews say. So we actually also it's really cute. We made 2 levels removed from saying the tetragrammaton. The tetragrammaton was only said on certain days in the temple. Like a Yom Kippur would say it and everyone would respond. So it was said at certain very unique times. So since the temple is destroyed, Jews don't say that word. I've never said the name of Jehovah, the real way to say it. I've never said that word in my life. So
you've never said that your entire life.
No,
Wow.
because we don't say it aloud. We respect that.
I see.
You and I spoke about God's name and the importance of God's name right
Yeah.
now.
Hmm.
So what's interesting is that we replaced it with a word which means my master. And then because that word got such significance, when I speak colloquially, I also don't say the word my master, because that is the word I use for God. I just say the name. So if I want to say, like, if I'm reading a verse from the Bible
Hmm.
and I don't want to say it, I will change God's name. I'll say the name. In Hebrew, I'll say Hashem. And versus
Hashem. Oh, Hashem. Oh, Hashem means, I thought Hashem means God, but it's
Hashem, just the word Hashem means the name.
then, yeah, I see.
The Shem name, but it's replacing the word my master, which is
Hmm.
replacing the tetragrammaton.
Hmm.
It's interesting. Usually you don't take 2 steps away to protect something. You take 1 step away. If I say stay away from the cliff, stay 6 feet away from the cliff. I don't say stay 6 feet away from the cliff, and then
I
stay
mean,
another.
so yeah, so all this points to where you hold, within Judaism, you hold God to a high standard, or you put him in a different, he's a different being, or a different, or I mean,
My
and
master,
so
my
my
master,
master,
my king,
and
my
so
father, whatever. Yeah.
yeah, and so then by definition, yeah, you can't have 2 masters. I mean, at least from that perspective, the
You know,
verse,
you never say my king, my master, my father, my bud. You never say my yeah, that doesn't exist. There's always this pattern, and this is one of the things I think that more spiritual people versus more rationalist people kind of suffer through. The
yeah,
question is, even if you're a mystical person or a spiritual
hmm,
person, you still recognize there's a chasm between you and God, but you might think
yeah,
there's a point where it touches.
hmm,
If you're a rationalist, you're going to see like there's no point. They're just separate. And there's things that we see specifically in Kabbalah mysticism.
hmm,
Mysticism, there's 10 sephirot in the tree. That means there's 10 kind of aspects of God, and the top one is called the crown.
hmm,
And it's called the crown because the crown is the one thing that's not really part of the body,
hmm,
separate, so it could touch the heavens in it, but it kind of is touching your head. See,
hmm,
so they call that crown the point, because they want to make sure there's some point that's between the two and has
yeah,
that point that point of contact. Okay.
uh-huh,
Okay, the last thing we're going to do, again, and this is I kept this last because I don't really know the answer, but I think we're going to have to make up something. Okay. When I read this the first time, I really couldn't understand how it wasn't being repetitious. It really felt unnecessary when it says no one could serve 2 masters. I would have been okay if it said you cannot serve God and wealth. So we first have we have almost this one verse has an introduction, an A, B, and a conclusion. So no one can serve 2 masters. Great. You cannot serve God. You cannot serve God and wealth. Great. So now let's analyze the B, A, and B. For a slave will either hate the one and love the other. Okay, I mean, you're telling me that, I believe it. But the notion itself is really interesting. Generally, we don't think of slaves as loving or we think of hating. We generally don't think of slaves as loving ever. So we generally think of slaves as serving. He'll serve, if it said he'll serve one appropriately and serve one inappropriately, that's fine. But I feel like this actual parable doesn't really speak to me, because I don't think that this doesn't speak to my psychological understanding of slaves. That he's going to hate one and love other. So so let's talk about that. So one option is that, well, why would you love one and hate the other? It could be that when you have 2 people involved, inherently there's gradations, and then one is going to treat him better, or he's going to attach more to one or the other. So I feel like this is not a reality of that you would witness. It's a reality of psychology, that either the slave master would act that way or the slave would act that way. Again, so that's my first like observation, that why can't you have 2 masters? Because it's the nature of the psychology of humans to not allow for an equilibrium.
hmm,
Pointing out, again, this builds into our black and whiteness.
hmm.
Point out that automatically either the master is going to one master is going to gravitate more, and therefore you're going to respond to that, or you're going to love one more inherently because of that. Okay, so I don't know if you want to add anything. I find this very confusing personally.
Yeah, I mean, so in a sense, right, so much of his teachings leading up to this is about you should love your enemies, you should love others. He speaks about you have to go extend yourself to the others, right? As in, and that's difficult enough. But yeah, I thought
But at least these are opposites, though, right?
you
At
bring up
least
you bring up a great point, right? As a slave, you use the word of slave. Do slaves love? Is a word love and hate? Is this
they love going free.
Yeah. Is this even and is this are these the appropriate or the best terms to use in the context of a slave and a masters, right? And so
It could be slaves. There's a very famous slave for Rabban Gamliel, the one mentioned in the New Testament, his grandson, and he had a slave called Tavi. And that Tavi he loved, and he treated him special. And there's all these special. He endlessly praises him. He says he's smarter than everyone. He knows Jewish law better than everyone. Okay, so it seems like the master liked him, but okay, I know. Anyways, good point. But at least the A part of this makes sense to me. He'll either hate you or love you, because I think hate and love are opposites. It's a big argument. What's the opposite of love? I don't know if you in marriage counseling, there's a big argument. Is the opposite of love hate, or is
absence of love.
the opposite of love more than absence? Is the opposite of love to not care at all? Like I don't care if you
Yeah,
die or love.
apathy. The
Apathy.
opposite, apathy, right? Just lack of concern. You live or you do what you do. I couldn't care
Yeah.
less. So
So over
yeah.
here, at least I feel like we're defining them as opposites. Love is the opposite of hate here, which would fit more into the black and whiteness of Jesus. Okay, but if you look at the second point, or be devoted to the one,
One and
despise the other.
the other.
So again, when I see this, I find it very perplexing to try to understand what is really happening over here. But at least it seems that he's more focused on his own parable of how to serve God. I think if in Roman law, whether your property they could beat you, yeah, you're going to be devoted equally to them. You're not going to be devoted more to one, because you're going to be as devoted as you're going to be obligated to be devoted. What's interesting is when you differentiate Roman law from Jewish law. So Roman law, you were property. In Jewish law, in Israelite law, a slave is more you're more his mentor. You have
Oh.
to give him the same amount of food. You have to treat him like
Well, then, yeah, every 7 years is at the time of Jubilee, right? The slaves can be let
When I
free.
speak of it, I've given many speeches on this. I always speak about how I mean this to be condescending for American society, but in reality, I think the idea of mentorship being someone you literally have a real responsibility to work for that person, and you can't get free for 5-6 years, would really be a benefit to American society. That I find that like 90% of people are fine. 99 out of 10 are fine. But I'm sure 1 out of 10 people, they just need more help. They need someone to wake them up and say, this is what you have to do today, do tomorrow. And again, for Jewish law, if it's 1 year before sabbatical, it's 1 year, you could time it. It's between 1 to 6 years. And I find that the fact that our society doesn't have this kind of locked-in mentorship, where again, like in Jewish law, if you ever beat the person, he goes free. It's not slavery in that you have to give. If you only have one pillow, you give them the pillow. You only have one food on the food. It's a sense that you're taking responsibility for someone. So I feel like that kind of mentorship doesn't exist in our society. But over here, I feel when you look at the verse, at the B part of the verse, or be devoted to one despise the other, I think it's possible that when Jesus speaks in his black and whiteness, when he speaks of this bifurcated reality, it's this or that. Yeah, it could be that if they're not beating you, and you take the more Israelite side, the Jewish side versus the Roman side, yeah, you might like one more than the other. Again, it just seems like, what happens if I said to you, you have like, let's take this in another context. Isaac, you just had twins. You had a boy and a girl. Congratulations. And now you want to love them both equally. You want to treat them both equally. I don't think you would say it's impossible. They are both my children, and I will love one and I will hate one, and one will love me and one will despise me. I think the sense that you automatically, when you have two factors, it goes to polar opposites, is again a very Jesus thing to say, but not something that we expect in a realistic environment.
But in a sense, right? We have Cain and Abel, we have Jacob and Esau. We have Isaac and Ishmael, and so like in a sense we do have a.
Are you saying that they're polar opposites?
Well, in a sense, like we have a paradigm, right? Cain and
There's
Abel.
Different personalities, for sure.
Different personalities, yeah. I mean,
but that's not the same as saying that I just had twins. One will, or let's say I buy two slaves. I don't know. Like, will I hate one and despise one? I don't know. Like, it just seems that this parable very much doesn't exist in reality. It perfectly makes sense to us. I think it's such a good example, because I think it's such a famous one. And when you hear it, it makes so much sense. And then when you start delving deeper and deeper, you get all these questions. You're like, what does he mean?
The couple of the biggest takeaways were the theological servitude versus cultural servitude, right? Theological servitude, the verse in Leviticus, that's a very powerful word. That's again. So,
Thank God for Leviticus.
huh?
Thank God for Leviticus.
Thank you, Leviticus, right? And so to balancing both of those, both the cultural aspects of servitude and theological aspects of servitude, I mean, you say within Jewish law, you can have two masters, but theologically, you only have one master. And is he trying to set this up to prove a bigger point as you cannot serve God and money? But I still feel, because Abraham's gift was, God said, I will give you wealth, I will give you land, I will give you land, I will give you all this wealth and all this, it goes. And so there are places where wealth is portrayed as is described as a gift from God, as in He gives, right? And in the case of
100%.
but then here
all gifts of the physical reality are
from
throughout Deuteronomy.
yeah, and then here,
Your
right,
purpose,
somehow,
your reign, your money, yeah.
and somehow here, right, that same gift from God is set up to be against God, as in you can't have me.
You're bringing up a totally new point. So you're like, for example, in Jewish tradition on Rosh Hashanah, is the idea that all the money that you're going to get for that year is set by God. You're not going to be able to get more than God kind of set for you. It's the idea is that the money you receive is something that you can't fully attribute to yourself. Blessing is something that comes externally. So I think you're explaining now an additional point where you're saying, well, when Jesus has these three sections now in wealth, how can you be so against wealth when God is the one who's the giver of wealth?
Yes.
Right. So this is a new point, and that's a really good point. And I think Jesus would answer there's the reality that in the end of the day, like not many Christians took on the life of full poverty. There have been thousands in history, but I wouldn't put it in the hundreds of thousands. The life of full poverty is definitely a read of the New Testament. But again, like I think we're always trying to find the happy medium between the extreme read and the realistic read. And even when you look at the last couple of verses, it doesn't say like forsake treasure. It says like don't amass treasure. And when it says over here, it says you can't have two masters. It never says that you can't have money. Like he could just wrote like therefore have no money, or have no savings.
That's great observation.
There's so many, even like when the Magi come, they don't come empty-handed.
They come with gifts.
They come in a very God-like way, saying like, if this is happening, I need to have gifts. And you could always say, well, that's the Persian culture, they come with gifts, but not the Palestinian culture. So I don't know. In Israel at that time, it's a good question, but this is something that we can keep our eye on as we read. The Marxist and socialist reads of the New Testament are obviously normative reads, and it's interesting to see. And again, and a Marxist or socialist read is not one that doesn't have money. It's just one that evenly divides money. There's also the poverty read of forsake money and wear the loincloth. Okay, this is something we'll take in mind. Okay, Isaac, we'll call it a day.
Rabbi, on that note, this has been such a delightful conversation. There's so much to unpack and so much to learn. As always, thank you for your time, and thank you for your time for sharing. I feel like I'm learning from you. When you said about having a mentor, I feel like, oh yeah, I have this person mentor who's helping me understand what it is to be a Christian. And I go, oh my gosh, everything I've learned so far has just been so completely, it's not been the best way, or it has not been accurate. And here's a rabbi, a Jewish rabbi.
Listen, as I always say, I'm only giving my perspective. I'm sure Christians, and I'll reiterate to you, when I went over what we said for the Lord's Prayer with a Christian who studied Lord's Prayer, he's like, everything you said was wrong. So we definitely have to take a grain of salt and do our best. Okay, I'll speak to you soon.
On that note, Rabbi, thank you.